So let's look at some of this physical connectivity that takes place on that redundancy port. Some of that process that we talked about for 8.0, let's talk about it. First off, 5500, 7500, and 8500 have that redundancy, that dedicated redundancy port I had mentioned, right? I mentioned it earlier. We have a dedicated redundancy port. This redundancy port is used for the configuration, so config, of the actually wireless LAN controllers, the sharing of configurations between active and standby. Then we have our role negotiation. That takes place over that too. Role negotiation. I need to figure out who's standby, who's active. That takes place over our redundancy ports. You can see redundancy port here. Notice we are traveling a layer 2 network. It's a layer 2 network. We have our operations data. Okay, remember those client lists I talked about that were just a second ago? I said they're shared now. That's used here. Our operation data, our client list, who's what, who's authenticated, who's not. So that way, if I do have a failure and clients do have to switch over to the new wireless LAN controller, they don't have to reassociate because that client list has been shared with the standby controller. Standby controller is keeping track of that as well. Remember I said in 8.0 we switched to UDP? Yeah, that's over the redundancy port as well. UDP. We're now going to send one every 100 milliseconds. Now, one thing to note, this is 100 milliseconds round trip time here that we have that UDP message being exchanged. So you want to make sure that the quality of this link is such that it is less than 80 milliseconds round trip time. Less than 80 milliseconds round trip time, okay? Right here. I'm sorry I had to dive into that a little bit so I could see what I was drawing there. 80 milliseconds round trip time on this redundancy port. You got to test it before you put it in place. Otherwise, what? You're going to get a lot of false positives. You're going to say, oh, that wireless LAN controller's down. It's up, it's down, it's up. You're going to have primary and secondary switching back and forth a lot. If you are going to configure this value, this 100 millisecond UDP exchange, you can definitely do that. From 100 maybe to 400, whatever you want to use. You want to make sure that 80% of that link speed is where we're at. So if you change it to 400, 80% of that 400 should be the round trip time, the time here. So instead of 80 milliseconds, if you changed from 100 to 400, what's 80 times 4? It should be 320 milliseconds roughly if you changed it. Okay, so always 80% of the speed of the configured value. On this redundancy port, we have to maintain MTU size of 1500 or larger. That's pretty much normal operating procedure. And these are for our wireless LAN controllers. But what about on our switches? What if our integrated switches, how do we get that to work? Well, integrated switches uses WISM2, WISM2. And this has a dedicated redundancy VLAN. Does not have a dedicated redundancy port, although a port would be assigned to a VLAN or trunk maybe, whatever. But this is what we're looking for, a redundancy VLAN. It's important to note that the VLAN does exactly what we're doing up above. I can draw a big line here, right? These are different. It does exactly what we're talking about above. This VLAN provides that way to communicate redundancy between the primary and secondary. So how does that happen? We have our sinks, active and standby, right? That's what it does. Active and standby are synced with our integrated service switch. Our switch that can act kind of like a wireless LAN controller. One thing to note, this VLAN, don't make this VLAN routable. Make this VLAN not routable. Nobody else should know about this because this VLAN just carries information back and forth between two integrated service switches. And this can be, like we said, single or multiple chassis in our environment. You can see that here. One on the left, two on the right. You can see here that one of the slots for that switch, active WISM 2. One of the slots on this switch is active WISM hot standby WISM 2. We would set up a VLAN for those two slots to communicate and sync their information, okay, within that large switch. Now, how do we integrate this stateful switchover with a plain N+1 design? How can we marry these two together to come up with an Uber type high availability construct? Well, it's fairly simple. Many of you probably won't be able to do this in your environments, but let's take a look. First off, our stateful switchover process, that can be here on the left-hand side. You can see here we have our switch. We have a primary and hot standby. This is our stateful switchover, right? Boy, I didn't draw that too well. Let me try again. Let me change the color so it stands out more. This is our stateful switchover process. Over here, we have our N+1 design, don't we? Now, we can marry these together by saying our SSO, guess what? Remember, same type of information being shared through SSO. Automated, dynamic process, the stateful switchover process. So this is going to be a single primary on these APs, right? Because we are setting this up as 10.6.61.2. That is the management for these. That's only one IP, remember? Only one IP. So that's how we set it. Stateful switchover takes care of the rest. Then for our APs, we can actually assign these other secondary and tertiary APs out there. 10.6.62.2, 10.6.63.2. So we have failover set up. Both active and standby are combined in a stateful switchover process setup and are configured as the primary. That's it. These are combined together as a primary right here. On failover of both of these, if this entire environment fails, we still have the secondary and tertiary. You know what, folks? I believe they made a mistake here. I think this is supposed to be 10.6.62.3. I really do. I think they just made a mistake here. Because it's got to be in the same subnet. All right, so in this case, we have the best of both worlds. We have a dynamic process for the two main wireless LAN controllers that the clients see, the APs themselves see, as one single controller. We have a primary and hot standby. But other than that, if this dynamic process fails, if the redundant port starts to fail, if this whole process starts blowing up on us, we have the N+1 configuration with another wireless LAN controller as the secondary and another as the tertiary. Now, this process here, expensive, right? We have 4 different wireless LAN controllers. But it's one of those things you can be done. It's nice to have in our environment.